Hello and welcome back, and today I want to talk about QSnatch, but not just QSnatch. I want to talk about the subject of malware intrusions, brute force hacking, and ultimately intrusions into network attached storage in the whole. But the reason I want to talk about QSnatch, of course, is this is something that's been popping around on websites for quite a lot of the last week or so, but realistically it's been around for quite a few years, QSnatch, and it's gone through several different variants. I think the first time it was ever spotted was like 2014. But before I wanted to go ahead with this video, I'll be honest, this video was supposed to be made about 3 or 4 days ago, but I held off because I wanted to properly research a lot of the history of malware, because I want to talk not just about QSnatch, and I'm going to talk about remedies. And if you really want to know about how to avoid QSnatch and any of the intrusions that it may have in future, scroll to the end of the video, because there's a whole thing at the end of that going through with a QNAP just showing you exactly which security precautions you should do and how to avoid these things. But let's talk a little bit about QSnatch itself, what it does, how do people get it that we understand so far, and what have been the implications. So first and foremost, what is QSnatch? QSnatch is a malware that gets into your NAS, your QNAP NAS in this case, and what it does is it does several different things to enable it to do more afterwards. First and foremost, it will alter scheduled jobs internally. What that means is if you have scans, if you have certain activities happening within the NAS, it will alter those schedules, often just cancelling the internal cron mechanics on certain applications, or indeed all applications, but some of the main ones are to do with firmware. It will block firmware updates on your QNAP. Now that is an incredibly important bit that I'm going to come to later on, but it blocks further firmware updates of your NAS. It will not only not tell you there's a firmware update, but even if you do know there's a firmware update or you download the firmware update, it won't allow you to install that firmware update. Number 3, it blocks the malware program from QNAP, the malware protection program that allows you to scan the system periodically, have a schedule or ad hoc scans to see if there is any corrupt or slightly dodgy things happening with your NAS with regard to third-party ransomware hacks, that kind of thing, viruses, all inside your system. The 4th thing it does is it opens up an internal channel, a back door that not only allows these intruders to get in a more long-term basis, not just relying on the original hack, but it also allows that back door for them to steal the existing passwords on the system, the existing usernames on the system, and of course the encryption keys that are stored within the system. So these are very, very important things, and these are very, very dangerous things. Now, how did QSnatch come about? Well, the CISA and the NCSC, that's the US and the UK security agencies, they report that they still aren't 100% clear on how QSnatch gets into these NASs. Now, it could be a system of files that people download, because I know a number of people use NASs for like torrents and stuff. You shouldn't really do stuff like that. It's a bit dodgy in some cases. And if you do that, sometimes it will include a little malware byte inside there, and it grows from there. Other times you may be using an unsecure Wi-Fi network, and it kind of opens the door to your credentials, which are then passed on, and then you're led to brute force hacking and DDoS and stuff like that, where your system is being bombarded until eventually something slips through. So how did people start getting this? Although they don't know the precise entry point, one of the biggest, most concurrent, most common features of everyone that's suffered at the end of QSnatch here that's actually been invaded by it is because they have not been downloading firmware updates and not updating their system regularly enough. And now this is something that is universal to all NAS brands, and indeed not even just NAS brands. This includes the cloud, this includes non-internet service devices. You need to make sure your security updates and your firmware updates are up to date. Now, there's 2 schools of thought on this. There's a number of people out there that don't like taking to a new firmware update on a lot of programs, and again, I'm including console users, Windows users, Mac users too. A lot of the time people don't want to go to the latest firmware because they go, I'm going to hold off for a few days in case there's a problem. I don't want to do something that I have to roll back my firmware. So you wait, a few days, a week or 2, and you want to know that there isn't any undiagnosed problems in that firmware update on day 1. And I get that. Unfortunately, the majority of people that don't update their firmware are not in that group. They are the people that just don't update the firmware. They click the remind me later button on their Macs. They are the ones that when the firmware update button appears on their browser, and again, QNAP, Synology, Asustor, any of these brands, the little thing pops up and goes, there's a new firmware update available. Do you want to install it? You'll have to restart your system. And you go, oh, but I've really got to do this thing. That's why I've gone into the NAS. And then you just remind me later, and then you remind me later, and then you remind me later, until eventually you've got a system that isn't up to date in terms of security patches, isn't up to date with regards to exploits that have been seen and patched. Remember, NAS systems are just like any other piece of technology in this modern age of internet computing. They're only ever one step, quite literally one step ahead of those that create malware, ransomware, viruses. And the reason is they have to produce these firmware updates, and they produce an update, and then all of the hacking community, I'm just going to call them the hacking community for now, all of these people that want to take advantage of these other users, and again, this accounts to cloud as well, will then look at that update and then scurry through it to find exploits. And when exploits are identified, then the NAS manufacturer seals them up. And then it goes to the next firmware update, and then the hackers try to get in, and then the firmware, they are only ever one step further away. And that, again, isn't just NAS. That is, think of every PlayStation and Xbox hack that you remember. Think of every cloud hack. Think of every news report you heard that said 50,000 accounts have been breached. Only ever one step. So the first thing you really need to do is make sure not only is your firmware up to date on your QNAP, but make sure your malware remover is up to date. Make sure your antivirus is up to date. Make sure your security counselor is up to date. All of these things I'll show you later in the video. Now, let's talk about the virus itself, the QSnatch. We've already said about what it does in the background. Let's talk a little bit more about it, because as I mentioned at the top of this video, QSnatch isn't new, and it has existed by the same kind of nefarious group since about 2014. Now, last year, there was a report that around 7,000 QNAP systems had been infiltrated by people not updating their firmware, and eventually, a couple of revisions later, the exploit had been identified by this group, and they took advantage of it. That was last year, 7,000, it got closed. Now, they've been reported again by CISA at around 62,000 QNAPs, which is pretty bad. But the server that was performing this has been shut down, so the ends there. Now, the 62,000 people that might have it, you may still have it on your system right now. And again, I strongly recommend you check out the bit at the end of the video where I'm going to talk through the QNAP system and talk through the security protocols and the scanning and stuff like that. One, to see if, identify if you have it, as well as identifying what you can do about it or how to prevent it in future. But QSnatch isn't the only malware that's ever existed. There was WannaCry, we talked about that last year, Echorax, Moosestick, Megalocker. These all sound like 90s hacker names from the Matrix scrolling in green text. But these are all either hacking attempts or malware or ransomware that have existed on almost all the NAS platforms in one form or another. All of the NAS platforms have had this, and I include big elite data center grade stuff as well. But that doesn't mean that you should just avoid NAS, because when it comes to the cloud services, we are talking about AWS, we're talking about Dropbox, Google Drive, all these sort of platforms. All of them have suffered this fate as well, but in a different way, because hacking into Google servers, or all of these different platforms, and again, AWS and Amazon used to be known as S3, but web services, they on their side, they take care of their infrastructure. So these cloud providers take care of their servers. Their whole array of servers there, they look after those. So that side of things is near enough bulletproof. They've got redundancy upon redundancy upon redundancy, version upon version upon version, mirror server to mirror server to mirror server. However, it's at the other side, the client side, where there is any number of ways in which you could fall threat. One, again, unsecure networks. that coffee shops or internet networks and internet networks, not just the ones that use the internet, but localized, that can be monitored. On top of that, client apps can be infected. Add-ons and third-party plugins can cause these things, and ultimately mean that, for example, if you have a shared drive area, you can be one user who gets infiltrated by some sort of hacking exploit, malware, ransomware and stuff, and that makes its way onto that main server. And that main server drive that you've got, that cloud drive, the Google Drive, whatever, that you're synchronized with on your local system, may well be synchronized with other PCs and other Macs and other more in the network. And then all of they synchronize with that drive. Now, yes, cloud providers do have their own inbuilt malicious file detection, but larger files are not instantly scanned. And a lot of the time, cloud providers are quite heavily reliant on the client to make sure they have provisions in place. So they have antivirus, anti-malware, anti-ransomware protection in place. So when they upload the file, it has at least had that cursory check. And then in the background, as time wears on, the cloud provider will then scan through for any kind of malicious files. But that still comes down to that primary user. And it's the same with NAS. It comes down to the primary user. Cloud and internet have their own inherent advantages and disadvantages. But this isn't a case of QNAP NAS having a ransomware and therefore they are worse than the others, because it's not. Because every single NAS provider has its own hacks and attempts every year. You don't believe me? Google's right there. This isn't even about QNAP or NAS in general being better or worse than cloud, because it's not about that, because they've all got their intrinsic advantages, disadvantages, and exploitable moments. This is about the end user being more adept, being more reactive to these things. So as much as, and as sorry as I feel for 62,000 people that have been infected by QSnatch, and some of those users were not responsible for what had occurred, because sometimes these things just happen. A lot of the time, it comes down to users who do not update their firmware regularly enough. So if you are watching this right now, you need to do 3 very important things. 1, double check your backup strategy, because as long as you've got a backup strategy in some case, and RAID is not a backup, as long as you've got that, then you at least have a fallback. And make sure it is, if not a one-way sync, then make sure it's time managed. And that means if something hits, it doesn't automatically affect your backup. Make sure there is an element of frictionless separation between them. Number 2, make sure you've got the applications, and this doesn't just apply to QNAP, this applies to all of the NAS brands. All of them arrive with antivirus applications, anti-malware protection, 2-step verification, and lots of ways in which you can monitor your system. So make sure all of those are up to date. If you stop watching right now and update your firmware, okay, if you haven't already. And the third thing you need to do is double check your history. Go through the logs of the system and you can see which users are there. You can see what accounts you have, you can see admin roles, you can see non-admin roles, but moreover, you can check IPs, and almost certainly you will be able to very soon recognize an intrusion on your system at one time or another. And all of the NAS systems have this in place. Now, moving forward from this, what happens after QSnatch? I don't think we've heard the last of it. I really don't. I think it's going to be a bit like WannaCry, and WannaCry was bouncing around for a while. We've not heard much about that for a very long time, but I think QSnatch is going to come back. But it is a question of making sure your firmware is up to date. And if you don't update your firmware, the longer you don't update your firmware, the more time you are giving hacker and malicious groups to study these updates, study the intrusions, study the access protocol of that firmware, and try to find exploits. And that's the reason to update regularly. But I've already been banging on about this for a long time. I'm going to head over now to the QNAP I've got set up just over there. I'm going to walk you guys through all of the security protocols and all of the different things you can enable, disable, or check to make sure you're going to be okay moving forward. Let's head over to the screen. Right, so here we are on the desktop user interface here, accessible via the web browser on a QNAP NAS. This is a 5.3D, one of the newer generation devices, and it's updated with the latest firmware. How do we know I'm on the latest firmware? Go into the control panel and you can head over to the firmware update option, and it will alert you about right now what your firmware is and if there is a new firmware update available. Now you can sign up to those beta ones, but again, if you'd rather keep things nice and solid and reliable and kind of well tested, maybe don't enter into betas. But me personally, I like to play with them just to see what's new and up and coming. Now you will always get an alert at the top that tells you if there's a notification that tells you if there's a firmware update. But of course, the firmware update of your overall system isn't enough. The firmware of individual applications is also very, very important. So one of the things you can do is head over to the App Center and have a look at the available updates for your apps. If you go into the All Updates option, if an app does have an update available, it will tell you. There will be a little green arrow here that tells you an app update is available. So I regularly recommend that you pop into here just to see if there are any available to you. Now, on top of that, let's talk about some of the individual ways that the QNAP platform can be tailored to be a far more secure platform for you and your own bespoke needs, but also ways in which you can just double check that things are as squeaky clean and tight as possible. In the control panel, you've got a far more analytical approach readily available to you that shows you a few of the ways in which you can monitor the device. So for example, you can look at different IPs that have accessed your device. You can make sure that only preset IPs, so preset devices, can access your device if you choose, and you can add one manually. So if you know the IP of your mobile or desktop or any kind of device, you can enter it and it makes sure that only that device can access it. On top of that, you can change the protocols of security with regards to different kinds of access to the device, and therefore you can prevent DDoS attacks where there's a lot of rules that allow different malware, virusware and ransomware to get into your device by constant brute force hacking. And you can change a lot of those rules too with regards to individual IPs. Again, access accounts, if you've got people that are either admins or non-admins, you can change those rules accordingly too, as well as change the certificate or download the security certificate of your NAS for access over the internet to make sure that your SSLs are up to date, and therefore that you can validate who is accessing the device and on what devices they use. Same goes for password policies. You can make sure that if people do create a password, that you can keep it stronger or weaker so they can use different passwords, and you can even change periodic password changes that will make sure that passwords have to be changed after a given period of time. Now these are fairly standard things that you can do, and if you go into privileges, you can obviously change a lot of the privileges of individual users that are listed here, but those are pretty basic things you can do all back end. What you need to do on the QNAP platform is to look at three pretty important areas. The first one we've already talked about probably the most, and that's the malware remover. Very simple tool that allows you to add a schedule to scan your device periodically. You can again run a schedule if you so choose at certain times of day, or you can make sure that you do it ad hoc. Now again, you can have it automatically update it as soon as possible, and again I strongly recommend having that option ticked, is this will allow, even if you don't update the firmware of your NAS, that malware remover will be updated, and therefore it'll have the latest revisions of listings of exploitative methods that are out there, and therefore it knows what to look for. And then of course sending malware remover scan results to QNAP allows them to stay on top of these things as well. But again, that's totally up to you, and there are lots of security protocols in place. But again, I know everyone's different. When you run a schedule, you can just have it at the moment. For me, I've got 3 AM when the device isn't primarily being used. You can just click the button if you choose, and it will run a scan in the background while you do everything else on your NAS. Now the malware remover tool may seem simplistic, but it has to be light, it has to be snappy, because you are still using a NAS that's on 24/7, and it will scan there in the background and check its available history and updated records of different malwares that QNAP are aware of. So again, and there's the listings of different scans that have happened over the last few weeks in the background. Now, as you can see, it's finished the scan. It's pretty quick, and obviously it will be dependent on the size of your storage array, how quick it is, and of course the power of your NAS. But a much more broader tool is one of Security Counselor. The Security Counselor platform, This app is kind of like an all-encompassing single access, single portal view of all the security operations running on your NAS. So you can change a lot of the different individual setups with regards to the malware protector, as well as the individual security setup, where it will scan the entire NAS looking for any area of, a door left open here, a window left open there, and it will scan through. You can install an antivirus, and there are different antiviruses available, not only just from QNAP themselves. They've got their own back-end antivirus scanning there in the background where things can be sent into a quarantine, and you can update the library of different virus records and its database so it knows what it's looking for quite frequently, and you can do that either automatically if you choose or manually. And again, you can go through, and as things are found, they will be moved into the quarantine area. But of course, you may not want to use their own antivirus. Maybe you've got a license with a company like McAfee. Now, McAfee, you can get a free trial included with your NAS. It's a 30-day trial, or you can use an existing McAfee account if you choose. But this will allow you to either do scheduled scans of your QNAP NAS long term, where it will scan for viruses within your system and those files, but also a real-time scan. And that means every single file that is uploaded and downloaded onto your NAS will be scanned. So all of the traffic that passes through will be scanned for viruses by McAfee, and then at the same time you've got the malware remover that's going to do periodic scans of your system to double check those files. So again, lots of options open to you. And again, McAfee, customizable, updatable index, a schedule can be set in the background, and there's a record and history of quarantine files, as well as scheduled and completed scans in the past. And again, you can get lots of licenses for this software directly from McAfee or through the QNAP store. So heading back into the Security Council app, what this allows you to do is run different security policies. So you can change how certain activities are either handled or you, the end user, are alerted to. So at the moment, I've got a basic security policy. Normally, I would not recommend that to anyone. But because I run a lot of tests remotely on this NAS, and a lot of the tests I run for you guys in my performance reviews and software overviews need to be a little bit more streamlined, I will have it at basic. But most users, I think, should have it at intermediate. It will allow firmware updates, and particularly core firmware updates, to be actioned automatically if the system is in idle. So if you have an active read-write operation, it won't update the system software. But if the system is in idle, it will use that time to update to the latest firmware. And the same goes for NAS updates, where you can tailor it to all updates, just core system updates, or no updates being actioned. Lots of information there in the background, and lots of settings that will be set automatically. You can also set a custom setup of your security protocol, where you can pick and choose just how you want the device to action different protocols there in the background. Now, if we come out of that, we can go into the security settings, and a lot of these will be very familiar to those that we saw on the control panel earlier, but these will allow you to go just a little bit deeper. So for example, with regard to the password policy, it will also allow you to enable two-step verification. Now, two-step verification, if you've ever used a lot of the modern Google applications or a lot of online plugins, two-step verification is when you're using a device via a tablet or a browser or something, but then it will ask you to use an authentication application, which is a separate one, and there's a really great one from Google as well, and it will recommend different authenticator apps. And these will force you to enter a 6 or 8 or 4-digit number, alpha numerical, from your mobile device, your mobile phone, your tablet or whatever, to enter into this screen when you're logging in. Now, every time you use an authenticator app, it refreshes that code every 30 to 60 seconds. So even if someone got hold of that code from your device, they only have 30 seconds to use it. So they have to have your mobile phone, the ability to unlock your mobile phone, they'd have to have the login credentials for your PC and NAS, and be able to get in. So I do recommend two-step verification. The only reason I don't enable it on my NAS here for these videos is because it would make logging in and logging out and updating between videos quite tedious for you guys to witness. But I do recommend two-step verification for other users, particularly in the Security Counselor area. Now again, it will recommend applications that you either have or haven't installed here. I've got the two main recommended applications here, but there are other applications available from other providers, as well as third-party apps that you can download. But again, if you want to keep things squeaky clean, maybe avoid those third-party apps from third-party providers like QNAP Club. Now, the security advisor can report to QNAP. You can disable that if you don't want it to. Me personally, I would allow it to report these vulnerabilities if ever any are found, because it does help keep the platform squeaky clean, and comes back to what I was saying earlier about any NAS brand, and indeed any technology brand that has anything to do with the internet or the cloud, only ever being one step ahead of hackers. So again, make sure you update your firmware regularly. Make sure your password, if you do think you have been affected by this ransomware, make sure you change your password. If you can't enable the malware protector, or you can't get into any of these applications and you try to open them up and they won't open, there is a very good chance that you have been hit by QSnatch. And if you head over to QNAP's own website, they have got regular updates on this QSnatch event. There's been a few more, and again, as this has been going on since last year, there are updates going back to last year as well, I recommend you check out. And I'm sure QNAP are updating a lot of their protocols right now in light of recent events. As mentioned, QNAP are not the only company out there to get targeted by these things. If you have a look at the QNAP Security Advisories page, you can see a list of all the different attempts that are made against QNAP NASs all of the time. You can also detail exactly what QNAP are doing to prevent this and what changes they have implemented on their side and the recommendations they have for you that are generally shown within your NAS. This is done with Synology as well. Every brand gets different attacks. Every brand gets different vulnerabilities that are highlighted to them, either by end users in a negative sense, or that have been caught before they can cause any long-term damage. So just remember, this isn't something that's just affecting QNAP. This is something that affects all NAS brands as well as third-party cloud providers too. And that's an incredibly important bit there, because if you are a cloud user, don't think you're exempt just because it's Google and who would hit Google. It's about your local devices. But as I say, a lot of today is about preparing for stuff like this and making sure that you are protected moving forward, because QNAP are not alone in this. Hackers are always going to try to hack data, given the value of data in 2020 moving forward. So I recommend, regardless if you're QNAP, Synology, Asustor, TerraMaster, HP, whoever you are, and if you're using third-party cloud services, make sure your local programs are up to date. I do recommend Malware. That's one that I do use quite a lot for a lot of my local PCs, and I strongly recommend Malware for PC platforms. I generally find they've been the most reliable in protecting me going forward. So if you've got PC systems, Malware, and when I synchronize with cloud providers and NAS providers, they have stopped a number of different attacks on my own systems over the years. But with regards to the NAS itself, use the tools that I've talked about today. Installing Hybrid Backup Sync 3 is real straightforward. Just find it in the backup and sync area of the App Center. Once it's installed, you can create that multi-tiered backup strategy in the background on your device. This will allow you to have a fallback position in case something does go wrong. You can come up with a simple NAS to NAS backup. You can create synchronization jobs. You can also go all the way down to Apple Time Machine and other more basic, I'd say more techie level stuff. You can even do that USB backup, time managed if you so choose. And again, lots of options open to you. You can create a new job real easy, all from here. It's incredibly straightforward and does allow a myriad of different ways to back up individual folders or your entire NAS. So you can go ahead and use NAS to NAS, NAS to another folder within the NAS. Do not recommend that one. And of course, those cloud providers as well. So again, utilize those where possible. In terms of your overall internal storage, I will always say have a RAID level, but RAID is fairly ineffectual against a malware intrusion. And when it comes to malware, it's a two-stage thing, isn't it? First part is to take your security credentials and create a way into your system. And the second one is to get your data. So make sure if they do get into your data and then start doing ransomware where they lock your system and charge you to try to get a password, make sure you have got snapshots there in the background being stored off-site. So you can create a snapshot onto an external device and therefore have those snapshots that you can revert back to. Because if you've still got access to your NAS, that can still be done. And on top of that, you can always remember that external storage and the restoration of those backups in Hybrid Backup Sync 3 are always an option too. What I'm saying is there are lots of ways in which you can protect your data today, both from malware intrusions, antivirus protection built in, and protection from data loss in a myriad of ways, and particularly ransomware, that one from last year, in the form of WannaCry. So, thank you so much for watching. These are all of the ways in which you can protect yourself and your data on your QNAP NAS currently, but make sure you update that firmware, guys, because that is the biggest killer here when it comes to this, and you can only ever be one step ahead of the hackers. So I'll see you next time.